Picture this, a champion boxer stepping into a strongman competition. Their speed and precision are unmatched, but those skills won't help them lift a 500-pound barbell. Now a strongman, they're built for sheer strength and power. But imagine them trying to keep up with a CrossFit athlete's high-intensity pace. Sure, they have the strength, but do they have the endurance? And a CrossFit athlete? Well, they dominate with versatility and stamina. But put them in a boxing ring, and they may not have the precision or technique to go toe-to-toe. Why? Because greatness shines when it's in the right context. And when it comes to cameras, it's the right tool for the right job. Now I must disclose that this video is a paid partnership with Nikon, but I was free to provide my honest and unfiltered feedback, including positive and negative elements, and all opinions in this video are my own. So now that the dust has settled, finally it is time for me to check out the Nikon Z6 III. Now, most of you guys probably don't know, but I actually started on Nikon DSLR cameras. I started with the D90, then I went up to like the D7200, and then eventually I got the D750, which is their full frame DSLR, and it was incredible. This is where I literally put in my hours when it came to photography, and the Nikon Z6 III is an insane camera. Now I've used this for almost a month now, and it's been an absolute incredible experience, mainly for the fact that this thing is an incredible hybrid camera, does photos and videos incredibly well, and the price of this thing, wow, it's phenomenal. Let's talk about it. So just a quick breakdown of the Nikon Z6 III. It's a partially stacked 24.5 megapixel sensor, which is about 3.5 times faster than the Z6 Mark II. It has 8 stops of IBIS. It's got an electronic shutter of up to 1/16,000th of a second. It uses the EN-EL15C batteries. It's got a 5.76 million dot EVF. It's got a 2.1 million dot fully articulating screen. It runs on one CFExpress Type B and one SD card. It has one USB slot, a HDMI slot, a 3.5mm jack in, and a headphone jack out. It weighs a total of 670 grams, and at the moment you can get it for about 2,200 US. I think one of the most impressive things about this is actually the sensor. It's a partially stacked sensor. It's 24.5 megapixels, so it's going to be great for photo and video. But the thing that makes this thing absolutely interesting is that partially stacked sensor gives a really fast readout when it comes to video. You got about 9.47 milliseconds in 6K NRAW. That is pretty incredible. And yes, it does actually record NRAW internally into the camera itself, but not just NRAW, you can actually do Prores RAW internally as well, Prores HQ, and also your H.265 codecs. And the impressive thing about NRAW internally into Z6 III, you can do 6K up to 60 frames per second with no crop. It's absolute full frame, which is absolutely insane. And the ProRes RAW internally isn't as impressive as NRAW with 6K 60 frames per second. You can do 6K up to 30 frames per second. And the ProRes 422 HQ actually gives you 5.4K up to 30 frames per second. But then if you don't want to deal with NRAW or ProRes, you still have the ability to do H.265, which gives you 5.4K up to 60 frames per second. And if you want 4K at 120 frames per second, you have to go into that DX crop, which is pretty much just your 1.5 times crop, and it gives you that 4K 120 frames per second. And as a video shooter, it's really impressive that we have these kind of codecs if we're going to be using, DaVinci, Premiere Pro, Final Cut. It just gives us so much more flexibility, and especially if we're, collaborating and working with other creators and they need specific files, we can actually chop and change in between different files, which is just incredible and just gives you so much value in this camera. And I did mention NRAW, and yes, we do have to talk about it. Now, if you do use DaVinci, and I know a lot of users use DaVinci these days, it's an incredible codec that you can actually throw in there. You've got so much flexibility when it comes to white balance and adjusting your exposure, and just pushing and pulling the footage a lot more than you would generally with like a H.265 or a H.264 file. The main thing for me when it comes to RAW codecs is essentially just the raw data that comes off the sensor. You don't have any noise reduction, which we'll talk about in a second, but you just get a better image overall. And you can adjust, your white balance, your tint, exposure, sharpness, highlights, all those kind of things just so much better when it's not compressed into a H.265 or H.264 file. Now, there is a little bit of a pipeline that you do have to follow. Nikon themselves have made a couple of videos on YouTube, but you do have to follow that to bring it back to the correct color space transform. And similar thing when it comes to Premiere Pro, instead of a Rec 709 color space, it should be a Rec 2020 or BT 2020 color space. But when it comes to that ProRes RAW file, if you bring it into Premiere Pro, you don't really have much flexibility in comparison to the NRAW in DaVinci. But Final Cut Pro still gives you a little bit more when it comes to ProRes RAW, because that is actually native to that software. But still, if you're an aspiring colorist or you just love color grading in general, NRAW in DaVinci is going to give you the best results. Now, as I mentioned, why NRAW and ProRes RAW is a better codec generally when it comes to, getting the best looking footage is that it's raw data coming off the sensor and there's no noise reduction added directly to the footage. If it's a compressed H.265 footage, there is added noise reduction and you'll see this kind of macro blocking / sort of smoothing look. Like I said, this is pixel peeping and most people generally won't notice the difference. So that means with NRAW and ProRes RAW, you're probably going to have to use noise reduction in your NLE to sort of bring back the noise to make it look very similar to the H.265, but it will probably look better in the end process. But also that's a whole nother step and most jobs don't require these RAW codecs. Now, also talking about noise, the Nikon Z6 III has a base ISO of 800 in N-Log, and then the noise performance actually cleans up at about 6400 ISO, but it's not technically a second base ISO, but if you do want to go into that higher level, 6400 will give you the best results there. And this footage was actually shot with ISO 6400, and it was super clean in my opinion. Now, one of the biggest benefits about having a partially stacked sensor is the readout speed of this sensor. Now, it's about 9.4 milliseconds when it comes to NRAW 6K, which is pretty impressive and definitely one of the best in its range. And having a fast readout sensor is really impressive when it comes to sports, action, wildlife. When you're kind of whipping the camera around and you need to capture fast-paced motion, this is going to make it look really seamless. And it's going to limit the warping that you generally see in slow CMOS sensors. It's just going to make it look much more natural. And generally when it comes to rolling shutter effects, I personally don't see it when it comes to my sports videography. There's only a very certain type of person or type of scenario that you may actually see this, and that's kind of like car rolling shots. Trees may be a little bit skewed, vertical lines may seem like they're a little bit off if you have a slower reading sensor. But this one, you shouldn't have too many issues because it's really fast. Now, because you can do NRAW and ProRes RAW internally, they do use the CFExpress Type B cards. Now, these are my favorite because they are incredibly cheap for what they actually give you, and they're super robust. I just absolutely love this format, and I wish every camera manufacturer actually started using the CFExpress Type Bs. Now, the one small caveat with recording internally into the Z6 III is that you can't actually do redundant recording, but for me personally, I actually don't do any redundant recording. I just rely on my cards and recording into one card slot. But if you do want that kind of redundant recording, you can actually record internally into the Z6 III, but then externally through into like an Atomos recorder. Now, the biggest thing that I love when it comes to exposing is waveforms first. That is one of my favorite tools when it comes to exposing a scene. Zebras comes next, and the great thing is that the Z6 III has the waveforms internal, but you can select a small sort of waveform in the corner, or you can actually have a big, large waveform there as well. And the great thing is if you do actually have an external monitor, then you can keep the large waveforms down there, and then the external monitor is where you can actually look at. It really just depends on the workflow you're actually having with these kind of cameras. Now, for me personally, specifically when it comes to these type of videos, I do like having that side flip screen, and the Z6 III actually has that fully articulating screen where you can actually see yourself or, pivot around and have a whole bunch of different types of shooting styles, which is really good. Now, the one thing that's kind of plagued Nikon cameras in the past is autofocus, and autofocus is one thing that you probably don't have to worry about anymore. They've really dialed it in, and it is absolutely incredible. It seems to be super sticky on whatever object you actually put it in. You can put it into auto object, or you can actually select people, animal, vehicles, or airplanes, but generally you leave it in auto unless you know exactly what you're going to be focusing on. And when it comes to autofocus in stills and video, they are different. AF continuous seems to work the best in stills, and AFF seems to work the best in video. And the autofocus area and the tracking speed purely is up to how you shoot. And it's tracking me perfectly fine, even if I go behind the bushes and come from out of the bushes, it seems to be tracking on me really well. And overall, I haven't really had any issues when it comes to autofocus. I think Nikon have done extremely well with this new system. And if I did want to speed up my autofocus when it comes to tracking a subject coming towards me, this is where I just turn up the autofocus speed to maybe 3 or 4. You just make it a little bit faster than what it actually is. Now, just for reference, pretty much all the videos that I've shot with the Nikon Z6 III, I've had autofocus speed set to -2. And I've had the autofocus tracking sensitivity set to 5. Now you do have to find your favorite sweet spot, how you actually want to track it, if you want it to pull very slowly from one subject to another, if you want to make sure it gets really sticky. These are the things that you really need to adjust to your liking. I guess there's one small downside with the whole Nikon ecosystem and their lenses is that their lenses are actually quite big. But for me, I like to actually have larger cameras, specifically when it comes to my sports shooting, because it makes it feel a lot more natural. I can actually use my muscles to control the camera a lot better than having a lighter camera, because lighter cameras just, for me personally, it just doesn't feel right. I prefer to have that larger top handle and, you know, work with larger cameras. Now, when it comes to stills, I don't really do too much, but it is really impressive when it comes to the capabilities. You can do 20 frames per second with RAW in this thing, but you can actually do up to 120 frames per second. Yeah, it does have a DX crop and it is JPEG, but if you are producing a lot of sports content and you need 120 frames per second, JPEGs are perfectly fine, because that's kind of what we use when it comes to sports content, because it's easier, smaller files that you can really flick off to the clients really quickly. But that is just super impressive when it comes to the stills, and that is definitely due to that processor that's in here and the partially stacked sensor. When it comes to these JPEG files as well, they're about 2.2 sort of megabytes, and you can see the dimensions here, 2656 by 3984. And then if we go to the full frame NEF files, they're about 15 to 16 megabytes, so they are significantly larger, and it covers the 4040 by 6064 frame. Also, when it comes to stills, you do have the ability to do pre-capture, which is incredible. So this allows you to do up to 0.3, 0.5, or 1 second pre-capturing the images before you hit the shutter button. So essentially, it's kind of buffering the images, and then when you hit that shutter button, it's going to capture up to 1 second beforehand of when you actually press that shutter, so you don't miss any action. But it also has after release as well. So there is a maximum, which I think is about 4 seconds, but you can do 1, 2, or 3 seconds after you hit that shutter button. So just be careful of this, because you could have up to 120 frames per second in a second. And if it's 1 second beforehand and 4 seconds afterhand, you've essentially got 5 seconds worth of the 120, which is what, 600 images? It's pretty insane if my maths is correct, but 600 images is crazy to sort of filter through. And like I said, just be aware of it, but it is a pretty amazing mode. So anyway, my friends, thanks for watching. I am glad I actually brought the Z6 III on my channel, because I actually think I might be picking one of these up. It is incredible. I love it for photos. I love it for videos. It just gives me everything I need when it comes to a hybrid video camera. It's phenomenal. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Let's get it.